Senator Moore.
Thank you, Mr President. As we know, everyone has a Gough story. And I'd like to say that his inimitable style was important, but unfortunately everyone tries to imitate his style. And when people talk about Gough, they inevitably go into the ponderous sounds to sound just like Gough. And over the last week we've seen way too much of that, Mr President. However, I wanted to talk a little bit about why I remember Gough and what he means to so many people of my generation. Senator Milne actually stole some of my thunder this morning when she talked about her dad's reaction to blue polls. I, as you know, don't come from a party political family, but my father actually had exactly the same response to the purchase of blue polls and would talk about it. I mean, I very rarely ever heard him talk about politics, but I heard him talk about the expense of that picture and also the fact that it didn't have a person or an animal in it. And how could it be worth that much money? In fact, I think in Dad's view, until the day he passed, that perhaps a dismissal was directly related to the purchase of blue polls. I think that was his view. But my mother, on the other hand, actually cried when Mr Whitlam actually stopped conscription and pulled us out of the Vietnam War. I was unaware of her concern about conscription. She had three daughters, but she was a child of World War II. She had many friends who had sons, and she was absolutely traumatised by the concept of having to send a son to war. And when Gough Whitlam made the decision very, very early in his Prime Ministership to stop that linkage, she was so overwhelmed that she cried. And she rang a friend of hers who did have a son and said, "It won't happen now." And that was particularly confronting for me. The other thing that Mum found disturbing and a little challenging, but I think she was thrilled by, was the very same TV interview that Senator Wong referred to with Margaret Whitlam about what was the role of the wife of the Prime Minister. And certainly my mother came from a relatively conservative Catholic regional country Queensland background, and her image of the partner of the Prime Minister was someone with good hats and gloves. But in terms of the excitement that that interview caused for women of that generation was something that we should remember. This was an equal partner. We have heard so often in contributions over the last few months, first of all when we lost Margaret and now when we're celebrating the life of Gough, about the true partnership that was the Gough and Margaret show. And for many of us, I think that for Australia, we got a really good deal when we got those two together to be part of the leadership of our country. And for me, the role that Margaret played in working with Gough was one of the stimulants to the exciting changes that Gough Whitlam's government brought into Australia, our society, and the hope and the expectations of women. But no more gargantuan tasks did Gough Whitlam achieve around the issues of equity, engagement and celebrating talents, those themes that we've heard that he articulated so well in '72. No more gargantuan challenge was that of the internal operations of the Labor Party. And the story that we've heard many times over the last couple of days was the way that Gough identified that within the Labor Party there was not equality, engagement and a celebration of talents. And the story in '64, when Gough went to talk to a Victorian group, and he said that he could not make an open speech to that group because there were two Labor parties involved. There were the men, the delegates and the candidates, and the women, members of the party, who were actually operating as support staff, working in the kitchens, making the tea. So what he did at that time was to start the ongoing journey for our party, which I know has been watched by other groups, to ensure that women, their talents, their excitement, their involvement would be shared equally, would be engaged in development of policy and would have those talents working in Australia. And for me, Mr President, I just want to talk about some of the things that Gough achieved when he got to government. And no better place to talk about it than in this place, in the Senate. And Queensland had some roles in terms of the way Gough lost government in this Senate, and we all learnt that at school. But nonetheless, I was so pleased to hear Senator Faulkner this morning also talk about the fact that Queensland Queensland votes actually maintained Gough's leadership when he was under challenge before that time. So I think our result was about 50-50 then, Mr President. But no sooner than Whitlam had become Prime Minister of this nation, and I know there were parties across this side of the chamber at that stage, but no sooner than he became Prime Minister of our party that he tackled front on the issues of equal pay for women in our nation, something that had been simmering for years. There had been some previous cases, but he knew, and I actually know this was part of the partnership with Margaret, I just know that, in terms of the fact that there was not equal pay for equal work. And through the work that Gough made sure happened very early under his Prime Ministership, we did reopen that case. And again, there was a movement towards establishing equal pay rights for women in this nation. A point, Mr President, which with so many of these things is an ongoing discussion. So in terms of the evolution of equal pay, that was an extraordinarily valuable time. And part of his government process was to establish the first full-time advisor on women's issues in any parliament. And we can celebrate that, and we know that Elizabeth Reid, who was the first advisor, was appointed particularly around the aspects leading to the 1975 International UN Year of Women. And we made a decision in our parliament, led by Gough Whitlam, that we would not just be someone sitting back watching this happen, but Australia would be engaged, we would be leading, we would have true involvement to look at how we could attain advances for women leading up to the international conference. And at that time, Elizabeth Reid and her office, which grew, was responsible for ensuring that a range of funding grants were given out to organisations which were women-focused, women-centred, all across our nation. Many of our refuges, our shelters, our women's health centres were funded initially with money that came out of this important change. So that when Margaret Whitlam led our delegation to that conference, she had with her proven examples of where the Australian Parliament had made positive decisions which were reflecting true equality for women. Not just a participant, but actually one that could show that we had made changes. Along that time, we've heard people talk about the issues around the change to the divorce laws, so that no-fault divorce came in. So many families were affected by that, and we trace still to this day the impact of law changes in that area with the ongoing horrors of domestic violence in our nation. The first parliament that actually spoke openly about this was under Gough Whitlam, about where the issues of domestic violence were important policy issues. They weren't to be put on the side, they weren't to be cried over, but they were to be tackled, and that we would engage, involve women in making those decisions themselves. I know Jenny Macklin in her contribution the other day particularly pointed out the fact that one of the early actions of the new Whitlam government was to take the sales tax off the contraceptive pill. Something that seems so straightforward now, but I bet there were serious debates in this place, if in fact they could bring themselves to talk about it, Mr President, about the change that actually made in that time, and the savings and the freedom that gave women to make decisions about their own reproductive rights and to be able to afford it and not to have to wait to save up or to borrow money to achieve that. Something so straightforward but so real. Mr Acting Deputy President, when I think of Gough's years, I think of inspiration and change and a flurry of activity involving our community. But I also think of music. When I see the last couple of days, we've seen so much film, archival film of the time, but throughout all that watching of black and white images, I could consistently think of a range of music that, for me, as someone who was at school at the time, sums up the kind of change that Gough and Margaret and the Parliament at that time was involved in. So I just want to go through. I mean, many people have talked about the It's Time campaign, and I think we can hum that tune to this day, and I won't. I was a bit concerned about how tight those T-shirts were, Mr Acting President, and I still have trouble thinking about Gough Whitlam in T-shirts. It's just wrong. It's just wrong. But nonetheless, those tight It's Time T-shirts and people singing around, it was exciting. Politics and political campaigns in Australia hadn't been exciting. They were speech-based. They were actually talking about what was going to happen. This was a community campaign with its own theme song, and a theme song which worked. So I think of its time and I hum it along, and I know that it's used over and over again, but it works for me. During the wage case and the work that was around that, which had evolved out of years of work from women who were working with their unions, who were working with lawyers to ensure that the issue of equal pay was on the agenda, one of the songs that was consistently sung through that period, which is one of my personal favourites now, is one called "Don't Be Too Polite, Girls." It was an iconic song that actually engendered the rights of women to have equal pay. So when I think of that time, I also think of that song. And to this day, union choirs across Australia sing this song, and it automatically engenders the issues of equity, engagement and enhancement of talents. When we think of that iconic image of Gough Whitlam with Victor Lingiari and those particles of earth, of land, being passed over, and the acknowledgement of genuine respect and land rights. The great Kev Carmody song, From Little Things Big Thing Grows, comes straight into my mind, and the co-location of that music and that image and that result, I think, will be in many people's minds, Mr. Acting Deputy President. Gough and Margaret also challenged the conventions by appearing in not one of my favourite films, but one which has become quite famous, the film about Barry Mackenzie. And when you hear the crescendo about the Barry Mackenzie theme song, Gough and Margaret's role, ex-Prime Minister and his partner of the country, who took their engagement with the Australian film industry to a new level, and one which I think would be beyond many people in making that statement. That song evinces the same engagement of this wonderful couple who worked for Australia, who were involved and epitomised so much of the social change in the 70s. And more recently, I have to admit, one of my personal favourites, and that's the work of Tim Friedman and the Whitlams, and a great song which was in their first album called Gough, which summed up the link between what happened in 75 and a young bloke of that period, and how that link was there, and that music just permeates my mind when I think about Gough Whitlam and what happened. And in terms of the thought that actually goes around when I think of the changes that did occur, sometimes there are touches of true operatic fervour, because both Gough and Margaret's dedication to the arts, and in particular opera, in progressing that in Australia and providing support to our national company and also engaging international artists. Wonderful themes that come forward of moving forward, giant people and giant personalities, but with that thundering aspect of operatic volume coming through. Mr. Deputy President, in terms of losing Gough, I was not sad. Many people were, but it gave me an opportunity again to thank him, to think of the many reasons we as a community and me as an individual have to thank this man who has provided so much inspiration and hope to all of us. We in the Labor Party would have, I don't think we could begin to count how much memorabilia there is spread across Labor Party offices, union offices, numerous prints of its time, numerous coffee mugs and oodles of books about the wit of Whitlam. We haven't lost that, Mr. Deputy President. We've just had another stimulant to remember and to celebrate. But the outpouring of grief last week was very confronting. And I want to end by just talking about a phone call. I have had many and emails, but a phone call from a very good friend of mine who was sobbing when she rang me. And she just said, "He's gone and he changed my life." This was a young woman from regional Victoria who had had no hope of going on to university in the late 60s. She'd had good grades, but there was no opportunity financially for that chance to make decisions about what she wanted to do. The Whitlam changes to higher education changed her life and the lives of so many women and men across this nation. and Ray remembered that. And she knew that her ongoing career, studying both here and in the UK and teaching and being involved in research around Aboriginal land rights and history, all of that was enabled by a decision of government that Gough Whitlam actually made happen. Mr Acting Deputy President, I had a chance to meet Gough a number of times, and a true gentleman was the way that I always felt that he was. One of the last times was a commemorative event down at Old Parliament House in his own stomping ground to celebrate the work of the Office of Women. At that time, he and Margaret were both there, so it's a few years ago, and there was lots of reminiscing and talking, and many of their early advisors in the Office of Women were there talking about how their careers were enhanced by the opportunity to work in an active government and how their opportunity to work on cabinet documents changed their ability to look at policy and to bring forward good advice to government. And I asked Mr Whitlam, when I was brave enough to talk with him, I said, what do you think was the most important thing that you achieved in your government? And he looked and he pondered for a while, and I will not do a Whitlam accent. He actually said, making sure women got into higher education. Now, when we know the list of policy changes and the impact that the Whitlam government had on our country, on our nation, on our people, that actually touched me greatly, and the fact that he said that. And it may well be that at other times other things came front of mind, but when I think about the way he said that, the response, and then that personal story from my friend, nothing could be more important. Mr Deputy President, people feel as though they have lost a family member. The grief that came out last week was the same as you would feel for someone in your own family, and in many ways, for us in the Labor Party, we have lost a true family member. Thank you, Mr Whitlam.